Chapter 4, The Heart of Shadows. The journey to the old keep was long and treacherous. Elowyn, Alistair, Selene and Lyra rode swiftly through the outskirts of the kingdom, the landscape shifting from well-kept roads to overgrown trails. The dawn had barely begun to rise when they departed the capital, but by midday the gloom of the ancient woods surrounding the ruins had set in. The keep, Elric's last known destination, stood deep within this forgotten place, its name erased from records and left to decay with time. Lyra, who had been unusually quiet for the first leg of the journey, finally spoke as they reached a clearing where the ruins could be seen in the distance. This place feels wrong. Elowyn felt it too. A presence lingered here, one that made her skin crawl. Selene glanced at her. "Are you all right?" Elowyn took a breath, steadying herself. "I have to be." Alistair pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "We go on foot from here. We'll be too exposed if we ride any closer." The others followed suit, slipping into the cover of the trees. The keep loomed ahead, shrouded in mist. Cracked stone walls and shattered towers stood like the bones of a long-dead beast. Vines crawled over the remains, nature reclaiming what once belonged to men. As they made their way forward, Lyra slowed her steps, whispering something under her breath. Alistair noticed. "What's wrong?" The elf frowned. "Magic lingers here." She extended her hand, tracing symbols in the air. Faint blue energy flickered at her fingertips. Something unnatural. Elowyn's heart skipped a beat. Elric's warning rang in her mind. "Beware the shadow that watches the crown." Then we need to be careful," Selene said, gripping the hilt of her dagger. They pressed on, the air growing colder. The only sound was their footsteps, until it wasn't. A low, unnatural growl echoed through the ruins. Then the earth beneath them stirred.
"The undead rise!"
The first corpse lurched from the ground, its hollow eyes burning with an eerie green light. Then another. And another. Within moments, the clearing was filled with undead. The stench of decay filled the air as skeletal warriors and rotting corpses dragged themselves from the soil, twisted by whatever dark magic haunted this place. Elowyn barely had time to react before Alistair drew his blade. "Stay behind me!" he shouted, stepping forward. The first undead lunged. Alistair cut it down in a single strike. His sword shimmered in the dim light, the blade cleaving through flesh and bone with practiced ease. Lyra, standing at his side, raised her hand. Her voice was like a song, her elven words twisting the air into magic. A wave of blue flame erupted from her palm, consuming the nearest corpses. "Burn, you wretched things," she called, her voice almost playful despite the danger. The flames devoured their enemies, but more were still rising. Selene grabbed Elowyn's arm. "We need to move." "But they'll hold them off! We have to get inside!" Elowyn hesitated, watching as Alistair carved a path through the undead, and Lyra wove her magic, casting bursts of arcane fire into their ranks. But there were too many. Alistair glanced back at them, his expression hard.
"Go, now!"
Selene didn't wait. She pulled Elowyn toward the ruined keep's entrance, sprinting through the fog. Elowyn turned back one last time, seeing Lyra unleash a torrent of magic, her hair illuminated by the glow of her spells, while Alistair stood like a shield between them and the horde. Then the shadows swallowed them, and the princess and her lady-in-waiting disappeared into the ruins. Chapter 4, The Heart of Shadow. The air within the ruined keep was thick with dust, the scent of damp stone and decay filling Elowyn's lungs. The corridors were narrow and twisting, the faint glow of torches long extinguished. Shadows danced in every corner, making it impossible to tell if something lurked just out of sight. Selene pulled Elowyn forward, her grip firm but steady. "Stay close. Whoever built this place didn't want people wandering in." Elowyn swallowed her fear. "How do you know?" Selene didn't answer right away. Instead, she knelt near a doorway, running her hands along the stone. A moment later, there was a soft click. "A trap," she muttered. "Pressure plate, just beneath the surface." She tapped the ground, then carefully disabled the mechanism with a small flick of her wrist. Elowyn blinked. She had seen knights and spies use such skills before, but never Selene.
"How?"
Selene hesitated. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "I wasn't always your lady-in-waiting." Elowen knelt beside her. What do you mean? The rogue sighed. You want the truth? I was sent to rob you. The words struck Elowen like a dagger. What? Celine still didn't meet her gaze. 3 years ago, I was part of a guild, a group of thieves in the capital. They were hired to steal from the royal family. I was sent to the palace under a false name, posing as a servant. My mission was to find an opportunity to take something valuable. Elowen felt a chill run through her, but Celine's voice did not carry the tone of a liar. And you didn't? The princess asked quietly. Celine laughed softly, though there was no humour in it. I tried. Her fingers traced another hidden mechanism in the wall, quickly disabling it. But then I met you, and you. She hesitated. You were kind to me, more than anyone had ever been. Elowen's breath caught in her throat. Celine sighed. I couldn't do it, and when the Queen found out the truth, I thought she'd have me executed. Elowen frowned. She didn't. No, she gave me a second chance. Told me that if I truly wished to change, I would serve you instead. Celine finally turned to look at her, and I swore that day that I'd never betray you, that I'd protect you no matter what. Elowen studied her, seeing not a thief but a protector, someone who had chosen loyalty over greed. After a long silence, the princess smiled softly. Then I'm glad you stayed. Celine blinked, surprised. Then she gave a small smile back. Come on, we still have a lot of locks to get through. They pressed on, deeper into the ruins.
Holding the line!
The air outside the keep was thick with the stench of rot. Alistair stood in the middle of the battlefield, his sword gleaming under the flickering moonlight. The undead surrounded him, their twisted forms clawing forward with unnatural hunger. He cut them down one by one. His blade flashed like silver lightning, every strike precise, every movement calculated. The bodies piled at his feet, yet still more rose. Behind him, Lyra's magic flared, a barrier of blue fire igniting along the path leading toward the keep's entrance. Anytime you want to stop playing hero and retreat, Lyra called, hurling another blast of arcane fire into the approaching horde. Let me know! Alistair gritted his teeth, dodging a skeletal warrior's rusted blade before driving his sword into its ribcage. Just keep them off my back! Lyra rolled her eyes. You're welcome, by the way. The flames roared behind her, forming a protective line that kept more of the undead from swarming them. Alistair exhaled, adjusting his grip. How much longer can you hold that barrier? Lyra smirked. Long enough. Probably. Alistair didn't like the sound of that, but he had no choice but to trust her. The fight continued, sword against claw, steel against rot, magic against death itself. But the enemy wasn't slowing. They had to move soon. We're running out of time, Alistair muttered, slashing through another foe. Lyra glanced at the keep and then back at him. Then let's make sure they have all the time they need inside. With a smirk, she raised her staff and unleashed a wave of magic. The undead reeled back as blue lightning exploded outward, sending shattered bones and torn flesh flying. Alistair took the opening. Let's move! They sprinted toward the entrance, toward Elowen and Celine. And behind them, the dead kept coming. Chapter 4, The Heart of Shadows, Part 3, Inside the Keep, The Price of Loyalty. The deeper Elowen and Celine ventured into the ruined keep, the colder the air became. A thick, unnatural mist clung to the floor, curling around their feet like phantom fingers. Celine moved ahead, her keen eyes scanning every surface for hidden dangers. She had already disarmed 3 traps, each more cunningly placed than the last. Elowen gripped the fabric of her dress tightly, her pulse quickening. Whoever built this place, she whispered. They truly didn't want anyone finding whatever's inside. Celine nodded. Which means we're close? But just as she took her next step, click! Her eyes widened. A sudden whirring sound filled the corridor as a hidden mechanism activated. Move! Celine shouted, grabbing Elowen and pulling her forward just as a barrage of iron darts shot out from the walls. Celine twisted mid-air, shielding the princess with her own body. A sharp pain exploded in her side as one of the darts struck deep into her shoulder. She landed hard, gasping. Celine! Elowen scrambled beside her, eyes wide with horror as blood bloomed from the wound. Celine gritted her teeth, forcing herself upright. I'm fine! You are not fine! Elowen pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. Celine chuckled weakly. better me than you." Elowyn's heart ached at those words. "Stop saying that," she murmured. "You're not disposable." Selene gave a lopsided grin, but there was warmth in her eyes. "I know, but I meant what I said before. I won't fail you." The princess clenched her fists. She hated this, being protected while others bled for her. But there was no time for hesitation. "We need to get you to safety." Elowyn gently helped Selene to her feet. "Can you walk?" Selene exhaled sharply. "If I say no, are you going to carry me?" Elowyn gave a deadpan look. Selene smirked despite the pain. "Then let's keep going." But as they took their next steps, a low guttural growl echoed from the darkness ahead. Something was waiting for them. Outside, steel and sorcery. Alistair and Lyra moved fast. The undead were relentless, and even as they cut through their numbers, something darker loomed ahead. Lyra could feel it, a presence watching them. They reached the base of the keep, Alistair panting slightly from the sheer amount of enemies they had to cut through. He turned to Lyra. "Can you sense anything?" She closed her eyes, reaching out with her magic. "Something is coming." No sooner had she spoken than the shadows shifted. A hulking figure emerged from the mist, a ghastly knight clad in decayed armour, its skeletal face locked in a grotesque grin. Alistair's grip on his sword tightened. The knight lifted its rusted greatsword, pointing it at them, and in a voice that seemed to come from the abyss itself, it spoke, "You will not pass." Then it charged. Alistair barely had time to raise his blade before the knight's onslaught began. Their swords clashed, steel against corrupted steel. The force of the blow nearly sent Alistair to his knees. He growled, pushing back with all his might. "Lyra," he called. Now would be a good time for. Before he could finish, another shape emerged from the mist. A second knight, this one moving unnaturally fast, appeared behind Lyra, its blade aimed directly at her heart. Lyra barely had time to react. She lifted her staff, but she wasn't fast enough. The knight's sword plunged forward, but it never reached her. At the last second, Alistair threw himself between them. The corrupted blade sank into his side. For a moment, the world froze. Lyra's eyes widened in horror as Alistair grunted in pain, blood staining his armour. The knight ripped its blade free and Alistair staggered. But even wounded, he refused to fall. "Stay behind me," he growled through gritted teeth. Lyra's hands trembled with fury. And then she unleashed hell. A wave of arcane fire erupted from her staff, the sheer force of her magic sending both knights flying back. They howled as the flames consumed them, their skeletal forms crumbling to ash. Lyra rushed to Alistair, panic in her voice. "You idiot! That was reckless!" Alistair gave a weak chuckle. "You're welcome." She glared. "If you die, I'm going to find a way to bring you back, just so I can kill you again." He smirked, despite the pain. Noted. But their battle was not over. As Lyra helped Alistair to his feet, the ruins trembled, and from the darkness, more figures began to rise. This wasn't just a keep of the dead, it was a tomb of horrors, and they had only just begun to wake. Chapter 4, The Heart of Shadows, Part 4. Outside, the arrival of Sir... Alistair shouted, his side burning with pain as the undead horde closed in. They kept coming. No matter how many they cut down, more clawed their way from the ruins, drawn by some unseen force. Lyra stood at his side, her hands glowing with arcane energy, but even she was beginning to tire. "This isn't good," she muttered. Alistair gripped his sword, panting. "We've survived worse." She shot him a look. "Not when you're bleeding out!" Before he could reply, a new presence emerged from the fog. A figure in gleaming silver armour strode forward, his deep blue cloak billowing behind him. He wielded a towering greatsword, the blade etched with golden runes that shimmered in the moonlight. The undead hesitated, as if sensing something greater had arrived. The knight planted his blade into the ground, his voice ringing with authority. "Begone, foul creatures, and return to the abyss!" A brilliant shockwave of divine energy erupted from his sword, sweeping through the battlefield like a cleansing fire. The lesser undead howled as they burned away, their twisted forms reduced to ash in mere seconds. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "Who the hell?" Alistair, still gripping his wound, recognised the sigil on the knight's armour immediately. "The Order of the Crown," he muttered. "He's one of the king's knights." The knight turned to them, his sharp gaze assessing their condition. "You are injured. You must fall back." Alistair gritted his teeth. Not an option. The knight studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "Then fight beside me." He lifted his greatsword once more, stepping forward to face the greater undead that still lurked in the fog. "I am Sir Garin of the Royal Order, and by my blade these monsters shall fall." The battle was not over, but they Inside, the truth of her blood, Elowyn and Selene pressed on. The princess kept a hand on Selene's arm, steadying her as they navigated the ruined corridors. The wound in her shoulder still bled, but Selene pushed forward, refusing to slow down. They finally reached a sealed chamber, an ancient vault hidden deep within the keep. Selene examined the locks, her rogue instincts kicking in. "This isn't just any door. Someone didn't just hide this, they buried it." Elowyn's heart pounded. They were close. Selene worked quickly, her fingers moving with skill despite her injury. The lock clicked and the door creaked open. Inside was a small altar, covered in dust and age. At its centre, a single tome lay open, its pages filled with faded ink. Elowyn stepped forward, her breath shallow. She couldn't explain it, but something in this room called to her. Selene stood guard, scanning for any further traps, but the princess's focus was solely on the words before her. The old script was difficult to read, but as her fingers brushed the parchment, the ink began to glow. The letters shifted, rearranging themselves into a language she understood. She read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "The curse of the blood runs through the line of man, touched by divinity, yet tainted by shadow. The god who was sealed, his will shall endure. Through his kin he shall rise again." Elowyn's breath hitched. Her hands shook as realization crashed down upon her. She wasn't just cursed, she had the blood of the fallen god running through her veins. Selene saw the terror on her face and immediately moved to her side. "Elowyn, what is it?" The princess's lips trembled. I'm not just cursed, Selene." Her eyes flickered with fear as she turned to face her friend. "I'm his descendant." Silence filled the chamber. Selene stared. "That's not possible." Elowyn's heartbeat thundered in her ears. If this was true, then the nightmare she had, the fate she feared, it wasn't just a vision. It was a warning, and it had already begun.